Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Copilot Control System Digital Deep Dive. I'm your host, F.A. Bugo, and I'm excited to hop in to the next session. Building agents at scale requires creativity, but it also demands a secure foundation. And in this session, we're going to explore how Microsoft Copilot Studio, Agent Builder, and the Power Platform Admin Center help to build agents responsibly and securely. And we're also going to learn how to manage data access, enforce compliance, and mitigate risk while driving innovation in your enterprise. I'm really excited to welcome our two speakers for this session. First, Mick Furlan, an engineering program manager specializing in secure agent development and enterprise-grade AI deployment, and Betsy Linares, a product marketing manager on our security and AI team. Over to you, Mick and Betsy.
All right. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. It is the final session of day one, so hopefully some of you on the call still have some energy. So quickly, I'm a product manager at Microsoft, so I will be covering the first part of the presentation. Then Betsy is going to take it away to cover some of the Purview topics. So today we are going to talk about building enterprise scale agents securely. Of course, we just introduced ourselves, so we can skip over this quite quickly. We are going to have three sections to today's presentation. Of course, we are going to talk a lot about security. So the first chapter is going to take quite some time. But then in the second piece of the presentation, we are going to go through a multi-step demo that's really going to give you a fresh perspective on how all of these concepts fit together. And then the final section, Betsy is going to take control and talk about some of the Purview topics as well, and how we can use that to extend some of the agent security. So in the grand scheme of things, when we do look at the Copilot Control System, of course, today we are going to be in the first pillar. So everything that has to do with security and governance. So do keep that in mind as we go through the session today. Now, you might have seen this slide before, perhaps at Ignite, more recently at Build as well, when it comes to defining what is an agent, because that is the thing that we are seeking to secure and govern. And what's key in this slide is that there are different agents with varying degrees of complexity. And the reason why that's important is that the approach that you will take from a security and governance perspective will inherently be different, whether you're dealing with simple agents that are simply used for retrieving information more efficiently, then it would be an agent that would be highly complex, autonomous, doing work on your behalf. So this is going to be a key thing to remember as we go through some of the concepts in the presentation today. So taking a step back, Microsoft-wide, fortunately, we do have great products that support all of these kinds of agents with different degrees of complexity. When you think about the typical information worker that wants to build relatively simple agents for themselves so that they can be more productive, we do have that on the agent builder side. And then we also have Visual Studio Code, Copilot Studio, Azure Foundry, and other tools if you want to build much more complex agents. And then today we are going to talk a lot about Copilot Studio, of course, which is sitting somewhat nicely in the middle. And what's great with Copilot Studio is that it's quite elastic, and the needs could be adapted depending on what you want to do. So you can build pretty simple agents with Copilot Studio, but you can also go into more complicated scenarios with the Copilot Studio product. Now, as I mentioned before, the degree of complexity of the agent does play a big factor in how you want to secure and govern it, right? So when we look at agents that are built through a product like Agent Builder, when you think about it to a certain extent, it is a little bit more secure by default, because we're dealing with an agent that the knowledge is mostly coming from Microsoft Graph. The agent has limited channels that it could be published in. So we're just talking about M365 channels. And that's very different from a more complex agent that we may build on top of Copilot Studio and Azure AI Foundry that can have access to a huge breadth of data, right? Which can have different degrees of business sensitivity, but also in terms of the channels. Maybe some of those agents could also be interacted with outside of the company. And when we're dealing with those factors, we do need to adapt our approach, of course. But today we're really going to talk about, once again, what sits in the middle right now, which is the Copilot Studio product and everything that we have to offer. So Power Platform has been at this for many, many years. And when we're talking about this approach for security and governance, obviously we are presenting it in the lens of Copilot Studio, but even Copilot Studio is part of a full suite of products. So a lot of these concepts and these philosophies, they do apply whether you are building apps with Power Apps, sites with Power Pages, or flows with Power Automate. And what's also important to remember in this slide is that these products don't necessarily live in isolation to one another, right? You can have flows that kick off some interaction with an agent. You can also have agents that are embedded into Power Apps as well. So do keep that in mind as well, that we're not necessarily always dealing with security and governance of these products in isolation. So any conversation about security and governance, we do need to strike a very healthy balance, because on one hand, we have all sorts of individuals within all of our companies that just want to be more productive and they want to get their job better and faster. But we do need to make sure that those people can actually do such a thing in a way that, let's say, doesn't put at risk business data, that is maybe not oversharing certain things, and all while keeping CISOs and CIOs, sleeping better at night. Excuse me. So we've had these conversations time and time again. We all know the considerations very deeply for all of these personas. As I mentioned, CISOs want to make sure their data stays protected, of course. CIOs want to generally understand and have peace of mind that everybody is building agents within the prescribed boundaries, and that there is a very clear cost efficiency and ROI that comes from that investment. And operation directors obviously want to make sure that they are making a bet on a technology, and that technology is going to always be highly available and that it's going to run smoothly. And really, with these personas in mind, that's how we've organized the full collection of security, governance, and operational features that we have in the Power Platform. So it results in these 4 pillars. The first one, managed security. We're going to talk a lot about that today, which has to do with everything securing data in this new AI-driven world. We have managed governance, which definitely caters to the CIO personas of this world. And we'll touch a little bit on this today, and specifically how to apply a lot of those security concepts at scale. But then let's not forget about the head of operations. Once again, we have a managed operations pillar. So think about application lifecycle management, observability, and essentially what you would expect to have for those handful of crown jewel agents that are very important in the enterprise, and you want to always make sure it runs smoothly. And the most recent newcomer is managed availability. So that has to do with making sure that those important agents are always up and running and available. So we're about to go into the content for managed security, but just before that, there is a zoned security governance and operations model that is quite common in the industry. Some of you might have heard of this model using color coding, such as green zone, yellow zone, and red zone. And the reason why we bring it up in this conversation is that it does provide some sort of a playbook or a way to think about how you can allow individuals in your company to safely build agents in a tiered way. So when you think about it, I'm a product manager at Microsoft, and for a very good reason, I probably shouldn't be able to create a highly complex agent that is available across the company from the get-go, right? But on the other hand, I should have the ability to build agents that will help me be much more productive, and maybe not just me, but me and my team. So the idea with this zoned governance model is to provide a perspective where individuals can actually get started with building agents in what we call a zone 1, a green zone. And you can think of it as a safe zone where perhaps some capabilities are limited, but we do allow individuals in a company to experiment and to unlock some new innovations there. But then as we get into increasing degrees of complexity and also exposure of the agent throughout the company, then we start thinking how we want to graduate that agent in different zones. So the reason why we present this is we are going to go and present all sorts of capabilities that relate to security and governance in the coming slides. And you can start thinking about how you may want to tier those different features so that you can reproduce this kind of model and allow everybody at a minimum to build agents to begin with. So finally, getting to the content. So we will talk a lot about security today, of course, for Copilot Studio. And when we talk about security in the Power Platform, we do start typically with what's called the Security Hub in the new Power Platform Admin Center. And the reason why we start talking about this often is this is the place that really gives you a comprehensive overview of what your security posture is, followed by recommendations that you can take to improve that posture, of course. And then finally, it's doing some sort of aggregation work, right? So it's trying to bring together all of the different security capabilities that are available in the platform today in the single pane of glass. So we'll see this in a demo a little bit later, but already on the screen in the screenshot, you could see how we have a pretty big breadth of security capabilities here. So we have network security, access controls, threat detection, compliance, and within those, within each one of those sections, there is, quite a lot of content, and that will only increase over time. So when we talk about security, the one thing that is quite important, and we're going to really re-emphasize that point again and again, is that protecting your data is actually very, very important, okay? And that's why we tend to talk about advanced connector policies. Think of this tool as a way for you to control what are the data sources that your agent can essentially use and build with, right? So today in the Power Platform, we have this concept of connectors, knowledge sources, actions, and this is a little bit how your agent, kind of connects with the outside world and also the inside world within the company. You can have a say in terms of whether an agent can connect to specific SharePoint or even SQL databases or even external data stores. So that becomes a critical pillar in what you want to think about as an IT admin when it comes to securing and governing your agents. It starts by deciding what is the kind of information that I want to allow my agents to be built with. And that is going to be done in the future through the concept of the advanced connector policies. So for those who have been in the Power Platform space for some time, this is a newer version of what was previously known as the data loss prevention policies. And what's different with this version is that fortunately now we don't have this concept of unblockable connectors, right? So previously there were some data sources and actions that couldn't be touched, but now we give you the full flexibility that you need to be able to decide what Lego blocks are available to your makers as they build agents. So we talked about data. Now we need to talk about the exposure of the agent, because as the agent gets shared with more and more people within the company, naturally there is a proportional increase of risk, right? So when you think about an agent that has been shared with the whole company, you will rightfully want to apply a little bit more scrutiny to that agent as opposed to one that maybe I just may using on the side for sort of my own personal productivity reasons. So that's when comes the time to apply the sharing limits. It allows you to control how broadly an agent can be shared. And what's great with this is that it's not just a question of controlling the exposure, but we can even go more granular and deciding what kind of permissions do we want to grant users when they are shared this agent. Do I want to share this agent just as a viewer? So that means I would only be able to interact with the agent, or do I also want to share the agent with edit access so that the individual can contribute and edit and play around with the agent as well? Then we are going to talk about this a little bit later on the Purview section, so I'll do just a brief introduction in this case. But going back to the securing of your data, the information protection does play a key role in that. And more recently, we have the Purview data map connector that is able to discover sensitive data that is stored in Dataverse, which is very often used as a data store for a lot of products built on the Power Platform. So that capability of data discovery is GA. And what's in preview now is the ability to actually auto-label some of that data based on the sensitivity labels that you have already established within your company. So there is a piece on SharePoint that we are going to cover a little bit later, but for now, I am going to talk about the Dataverse capability. So this one is in preview as well. So when I talked about the labeling of the Dataverse data, we have a screenshot here that does depict that. So, if you had a scenario where you have an agent that deals with medical records and there's perhaps a column that has highly confidential information, whether it's a phone number or credit card number, the MIP support would actually be able to label that appropriately. And the key thing here is that, I'll actually go back to the previous slide. The key thing here, and we'll see it in the demo as well, is that the sensitivity label will come through in your interaction with the agent. So when you are speaking with an agent and for some reason it needs to pull some of that more sensitive information, you will be clearly in the know at that point in time, and you can, adapt yourself consequently. So it's the same concept that some of you may be familiar when you open a SharePoint slide or a Word document in your company and it's highly confidential, you see that label front and center. Now we've covered just 3 capabilities, right? So we've covered the advanced connector policies, the sharing limits, we've also covered MIP. In reality, there is much more. And it could be a little bit tough to kind of get that holistic perspective. And that is one of the reasons why we've introduced this agent protection status in Copilot Studio. What we're basically doing here is making a more comprehensive assessment as to whether or not your agent is protected or if there's any opportunities for improvement. And that algorithm is actually looking at many more things than we've previously talked about. It's even going into some threat detection and verifying if there's been any potential threats there. It's also looking at content moderation and if any users have been interacting in an agent in a way that's not appropriate for that use case. So there's a really complicated algorithm that feeds into this protection status that we see on the screen. And what's most important is that there's a reason why this is baked directly in the Copilot Studio portal, because it allows the makers and users of the agents to know themselves what the protection status of the agent is, so that they actually could self-mitigate and be able to resolve some of those issues. So we're trying to also remove some of the burden on the central IT teams, which we know are typically quite small and nimble, regardless of the size of the company. And this is one example amongst many of us trying to help makers and users unblock themselves, as opposed to having to overly rely on IT. So now going into managed governance, and then I promise we will get to that demo. Those security capabilities, taking a step back, I'm sure perhaps many of you on the call today or watching the recording after the fact get a sense that applying these constructs on a single agent is already enough because there's a lot. But most of us are probably all in companies where there are hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of agents, and that number is only going to increase by a lot over time. So how do you practically apply a lot of these concepts at scale? And that's typically a concern that typically follows up when we start talking about security. So I'll quickly touch on this chapter to give a little bit of a sense of how we're able to help enterprises be able to apply these concepts at scale. So the first one, we start with this concept of a personal developer environment. So think of this as an isolated playground where everybody in your company is able to safely build agents in an environment that has been defined the way that you want it. So with all of the parameters that you want, but not necessarily while stepping on each other's toes with other individuals within the company. And the reason why we want to build that is for those that do have a little bit more history in the Power Platform, we have this concept of the default environment, which was a shared workspace where everybody can build in. But if we recall what I talked about at the beginning of the presentation, that's super difficult to govern because in this shared workspace, we're dealing with objects that have really varying degrees of complexity. So it's quite challenging to know how to approach securing and governing that environment. So this is why we've introduced this concept of the personal developer environment to break that up and provide a much more richer isolation, which makes it easier to secure and govern at scale. So we talked about environment routing. Some of you are probably thinking that it implies that there is a proliferation of environments. And that is true, but we fortunately have this concept of the environment group, which is really your method to govern all of those environments in bulk. And when we talk about governing those environments in bulk, what we mean is that we are allowing you to apply settings and policies at scale on all of those environments and be able to stamp those settings and policies. So practically speaking, whether you're a company that has 5, 10, 500, or 1,000 environments, the overhead is the same because the process of applying, let's say, a sharing limit for agents on one environment is literally the same as if you apply it to a group that contains 20,000 environments. And we have a little bit of a glimpse on the screen of what are the Copilot related controls that we have today. That too is only going to increase in time as we enrich in the list. I also want to quickly touch upon maker onboarding. It might not seem like it's security and governance related from the get-go, but it actually does play a role in this story. And the reason is because this is your opportunity as IT to inject yourself in the maker's workflow. So when makers go to the Copilot Studio portal, you are able to display a custom welcome message that comes entirely from you. And this is your opportunity to coach individuals within your company, where you can let them know how to get started, how to color within the lines based on the security, governance, compliance guardrails that the company needs to put into place. So this is really your opportunity to coach everybody in the company at scale. So do make sure that you take a look at the maker onboarding capability, which pairs very nicely, once again, with those isolated personal developer environments that we've just talked about not long ago. So very quickly, I'll touch on two things, the inventory and the Copilot Hub, and we'll finally get to the demo. We do want to talk about the agent inventory because just like today within all of our companies, we're probably dealing with a super high volume of SharePoint sites and documents and Teams channels. We can expect the same with agents, right? As we allowed everybody in the company to build agents, there is going to be a big volume of them. And it's important from you, from an IT perspective, to really have the full visibility into what agents are being created, where, and we have a lot more data about that. So this is why we've introduced the inventory, because without it, it would be very difficult to govern what you can't see, right? So this is really your first lens into the full breadth of agents being built within the company. We are starting quite modestly. So we are giving a full breadth of agents that are created in Copilot Studio in the admin center. And as we progress over time, you can expect much richer information about each agent. So to a certain extent, you can expect more columns to show up in this experience. And we will also start introducing ways to actually export that inventory data so that you're not necessarily forced to always work in the user interface when you want to see the inventory of agents. So we do know that's a very, very common ask for a lot of our big enterprise customers. And then also basic management things like being able to take actions on those agents so that if you do maybe see one that does need some kind of mitigation or help from an IT perspective, you could do it within the flow of work. And then finally, I want to talk about the Copilot Hub, because just like Security Hub did play some sort of an aggregation role for all of the security capabilities that are offered in the Power Platform Admin Center, the Copilot Hub does the same, but from a lens of Copilot, of course. So there is a new generally available version that is available in the Admin Center, and it helps you stay up to date with what's coming and what's new. What are all of the different settings and policies that allow you to fine-tune and secure and govern agents across the company? And even most importantly, get a sense of what is the usage and costs and ROI adoption of agents across the company. So quick demo of the inventory. This one's going to be a quick one because we're dealing with a simple list. I'll click play here and hopefully that comes through on the screen. So it is nestled within the Copilot Studio section under Manage. Now, all of the data points that you see here could be used to slice and dice the data. So in this case, we are looking at all of the agents that a user has built across many environments. Of course, we talked about the default environment before and some of the challenges there. We can see if there's any agent development happening there as well. And even in some case for global companies where maybe the development of agents is not approved everywhere just yet, we can also identify as agent development happening in geographies that maybe don't have all the approvals just yet. We can add some more data within the experience and we can slice and dice that data as well. And once again, we can expect that list to only grow over time as we add a little bit richer information about your agents within this experience here. All right. So we will move over to the real demo now. So this is the second section of the presentation, and we'll go through different videos. And it's going to be a specific scenario where we are going to build an agent that answers questions about a product line of laptops. And we're going to see the considerations that we need to think about when building these kind of agents. So considerations being internal versus external use and how that relates to authentication, how we can prevent oversharing, how we can apply those concepts in a way that we can easily apply those as we scale the adoption of agents across the company, and a few more things. All right, so we are now in a Copilot Studio portal. I said we were going to build the agent. Actually, it's already built, so it's going to save us a few minutes for the demo. So we have this agent which is going to answer questions about a product line of laptops. And that product lineup, the information is coming from that Word doc within Knowledge, okay? So we can imagine that the user who built this agent, in this demo it's Sridhar, is a well-intentioned maker, but we're gonna see how sometimes it's easy for some of the things to slip through the cracks. So now we're looking from the perspective of an unauthenticated anonymous user that wants to interact with the support agent. So first question, we're staying within appropriate boundaries. We're just asking questions about models that are available. We do get an answer as expected, and that's coming from the product lineup knowledge source. And then we're asking questions about which laptop has a better battery life. Obviously, that too is going to be replied quite easily. But now we're going to deviate a little bit from what we would expect users to ask. And we're going to start inquiring about future product releases. And as expected in this case, the agent is going to provide that information without a problem. And that was not necessarily the maker's Sridhar's intent when the agent was first built. So we're going to see how, from a security and governance perspective, it's actually quite easy and straightforward to secure this agent. So we are now, from the IT perspective, going into the admin center within an environment group where Sridhar is actually building this agent. So on the authentication, we can configure and make sure that only users that sign in with Microsoft Entra can interact with the agent. And then we'll also configure sharing limits. So how broadly can this agent be shared? Let's say this agent is super practical, so we do want to make sure that it could be shared with viewer permissions, but we want to make sure that Sridhar remains the only individual that can actually edit that agent. And this one is particularly important because if an individual other than Sridhar can edit the agent, then that may actually change the risk profile of the agent. So it is important to keep tabs on who can actually edit those agents. And what we quickly just saw not long ago is the publishing of those rules, which are going to get applied to that environment. And what's key here is that whether this group had one environment, 10,000, 30,000, it would go ahead and apply all of those rules across the board. And it's the same process whether dealing with one or thousands of environments. So now we are switching back to Sridhar from the perspective of the user that's building the agent. We are going to see the impact of those specific security controls. Under authentication, we are going to see that the option to interact with the agent with no authentication is grayed out. That's not something that we can do anymore. And that is as a direct result of what has been configured in the admin center. even going beyond that, the authentication, now I'm on the right slide. So the authentication itself does have an influence on the channels that can be used. So once again, the channels is simply the different locations where your users can interact with the agent. Since we are requiring Microsoft-based authentication, then the agent can only be interacted through Teams, M365 Copilot, and SharePoint channel. So we are finally back to the perspective of the unauthenticated anonymous user. We can probably predict what's going to happen next if we, once again, ask more questions about the upcoming lineup of products. Obviously, that doesn't work. And we saw how quickly it is to secure an agent and to prevent these situations from happening. All right, so we are now going to show how the sharing limits get enforced now from the perspective of the Copilot Studio product. So we see that the agent is already shared with somebody else. Now we do want to share it with another individual called Sean, and we see that we are able to share with viewer permissions, but not with editor permissions. And once again, that is a direct reflection of what has been configured in the admin center. Now moving ahead, when it comes to security, we can add layer upon layer of controls, right? So we can imagine that in this environment, we don't want to just secure agentic development, but we even have ways to block guest users from interacting with the agent. And what's great with this control is that it actually doesn't just apply to Copilot Studio, but also other products in the Power Platform suite. So do keep that in mind, because if we recall the slide where we talked about the Power Platform really encompassing many products, including Copilot Studio, very often a lot of these security and governance controls in the Power Platform, they do tend to apply to multiple products, and this being one of them. So fast forwarding a little bit, let's say that StreetR's agent is secure, the environment is well set up. We can always go to the Security Hub to always get a fresh perspective on what our security posture is. Here we see that the score is relatively low. And as I mentioned before, we have recommendations on what is the best next step, right? As reflected by the score increase that we would get when acting upon those recommendations. In this case, let's say I've already dealt with that recommendation, right? I've dismissed it. We see that the score has increased. And we can also do that again with another recommendation, and we will see the score increase as well. And what's great here is that this is not a one-way door, right? If at any point in time, let's say our network investments are different, and it's now time to move those back into active so that we can actually apply some of those IP firewall and IP-based cookie binding controls, we are able to do so within the product itself. So what's key here is really the dynamic nature of the score. So the idea is to always give you a just-in-time perspective on what is your security posture. And the expectation is that that's going to fluctuate over time, right? As new things happen within the tenant, new capabilities get released. So it's always a great place to go to know what is the best next step to secure your tenant. So to conclude, we saw a lot of interesting things in the demo. I'm not going to go in any particular order, but what's obviously quite interesting is really the ease at which we're able to apply a lot of these security and governance controls, not just to one agent, but any future agents that are created within the same development environment. We saw what is the interplay between IT setting up controls, what impact that has on the experience of a maker building in Copilot Studio, and then also what is the experience for a user interacting with that agent. So as you think about adopting a lot of these concepts, always think about those different personas and what is the impact of what you'll set up on those different individuals. So with that, I think now is the time to pass things to Betsy. We're going to talk a little bit more about Microsoft Purview. So Betsy, please take it away.
Thanks, Mick. Really appreciate it. I think my slide should be up. So my name is Betsy. I'm a product marketing manager for the Security for AI team. And today I will be focused on talking about how to protect your data with Microsoft. So People often ask us, how do I secure my data that agents use? And what we like to tell customers is to consider 3 steps here. Security teams have to think about how to discover, protect, and govern the data that their AI agents use. First, security teams need to have visibility so that they can discover the security risks, such as like data oversharing or unauthorized access to sensitive content. They then need to protect their sensitive data from things like data loss and insider risks. And lastly, they need to make sure to govern the organizational data to meet compliance requirements. Here's the best part for you as a maker or builder. You don't have to configure anything. Purview is natively integrated into Copilot Studio, and all these controls are applied by design. Your agents inherit the same protections that your security teams have already set up seamlessly. So I'll walk you through on how this looks for a data security admin, and then I will walk you through the maker and end user perspectives. As a security admin, I'm interested in looking left to right across my AI workloads, and I can do that in Data Security Posture Management, or DSPM for AI. Here, I see I can get recommendations like the one I see here on how I can protect my sensitive data used by Microsoft 365 Copilot agents. So let's click into that recommendation. I can look at my apps and agents here, and I can see the knowledge sources the agents are working against. Those in red indicate that a knowledge source has not been protected and agents are working with this data, meaning that there is a lot of organizational risk. So let's click into this Contoso invoice agent that is using SharePoint as a knowledge source. We can see it's red because it has unprotected content, as the recommendation on the home page pointed out. Now, when I click into this, my panel opens up and gives me details about what's going on with this Contoso invoice agent. It tells me very clearly that this Contoso invoice agent is using the invoice repository as my knowledge source in SharePoint. I can see that there are some labeled items, but there are also 10 unlabeled items. And this is the grounding data the agent is using. So we need to go ahead and protect that data. I can click on the Protect tab and go into recommendations of what I can do as a data security admin. Here I see 2 things. The first thing is that I want to protect all of the data in that invoice repository site. So I click on Add Sensitivity Labels for the SharePoint document library. And when I click that, I can choose it to be labeled with the corresponding label. And for this case, I want it to be labeled as highly confidential FTE because the label was not, the content was not labeled. And so with that, I apply it all with the click of a button, and the policy has been created. So now I've applied sensitivity labels to all that data in the invoice repository SharePoint site. It tells me the default label is already applied, so the content the agent is using as a knowledge source is now protected. Now the second piece here is this part, the recommendation. It is telling me to limit the agent from accessing files by label in my organization by using a data loss prevention or DLP policy here, which I will create. I create here to add a sensitivity label, and I'm going to click into special invoices, which is a special label that I've created so that only certain files are not summarized by Copilot or agents. And in this case, I'll click that and create the policy. And just like that, the policy is created. So as a data security admin, now I have seen a left to right view. I understand what my agent risk is, where my repositories are unprotected, and I have gone and deployed those protections for those knowledge sources and repositories. So now let's jump into the maker experience. So here, I've created the Contoso invoice agent, but I need to add the knowledge source it will act on. So here, I will go select my knowledge source, and I select SharePoint, and I add that invoice repository that we just protected in the data security demo. And we see the sensitivity label is automatically being inherited. Here we see the knowledge sources that the agent is using, and we see that data's protections have automatically been inherited and have carried over. These protections also extend if you are using Dataverse, like Mick mentioned, up to the column level. So now as a maker, I know that the agent is using knowledge sources that are protecting my organizational data. Now let's jump into the end user experience. So here, as an end user, I'm asking the agent to flag any discrepancies in the invoices. The agent responds with a summary of the discrepancies, and we can see the knowledge sources, which knowledge sources are being referenced here. First, because the agent has access only to labeled knowledge sources, it will only reply with data I am allowed to access with my user account as a person operating the agent. I can hover over the references like these documents from the invoice repository SharePoint site, and we can see that label has carried over, meaning that this data is being handled properly. Here we are simply showing that label information. And if you remember, you can also set up the data loss prevention policies to block agents from processing documents or prompts with specific labels. And so here I've asked the agent a question, but we see that the policy has kicked in, preventing the data from being processed or exposed, continuing to safeguard our sensitive organizational data. And the best part of this is that the end user doesn't need to know if any of this is happening. The security guardrails are already in place by design. So as you can see, Microsoft Purview helps keep your sensitive data safe throughout your AI workloads, and you as a maker don't have to worry about anything. If you are an M365 Copilot user and have Purview, those same extensions carry through. So if your security teams have set those policies up, they seamlessly translate for agents. So with that, thank you all, and back to FA.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Betsy and Mick. Really valuable content and showcase a lot of insights around agent building and governance that I think are going to provide a lot of value for our audience. With the last few minutes of our time for this last session of the day, we are going to dive into audience questions. So the first one we have is, what is the most overlooked security consideration when building agents?
Mind if I take that one first, Betsy? But please tackle on. Okay, so I mean, what I would say is the most overlooked security consideration, not just when building agents, but generally speaking, whether you're building apps or automations, is typically, I would say, like over permissioning to a certain extent. So thinking about it from an agent perspective, are you giving access to too many data sources that perhaps most use cases in your company individuals don't necessarily need? Are you oversharing the agent to an audience of individuals that don't necessarily need access to that agent? So I think the high level picture would be that over permissioning. And fortunately for all of those facets, there are ways to control that, right? So we saw with the advanced connector policies, determining what data sources can be used, you can control sharing, you can control authentication, and that would really allow you to get fine-tuned and really determine what is the right type of permissioning that is needed for the agent.
Awesome,
Yes.
thank you.
I was just going to add really quickly. I think, yes, like same thing with data when it comes to data, right? Making sure that your data is labeled, because the agents are acting against this data. And so in order to keep your organizational and sensitive data safe, you need to label your data. So that's the only thing I wanted to add.
Awesome, thank you both. Next question is, how do we, or how does an organization ensure that agents are remaining compliant as they evolve over time?
I can take that on again from a data security and compliance perspective. As you saw in the demo, as a data security admin, it's important for me to constantly be checking to see if there are any data security and compliance risks. Again, Microsoft Purview does a really good job at finding those gaps. So if there's any data at risk of being overshared, you will get those recommendations. So yeah.
Just add on a little tidbit. Generally speaking, whether it's Purview or Power Platform Admin Center, both products offer what we call like proactive controls and reactive controls, right? So to a certain extent, if you are establishing the boundaries correctly, that's going to live throughout time, right? Regardless of how the agent is actually evolving. So, if you have limited sharing to a specific set of users, that's always going to be enforced, and that's what we call a proactive control. Now, as Betsy mentioned, there is also the reactive angle to it, right? So maybe there is something new about the agent that we need to know about. And I think for both the Power Platform Admin Center, Purview, there are places that you can go to get a more real gut check on how things are going. But overall, it's really this interplay between proactive guardrails that you are setting up within the products, and that is always going to be respected no matter what. And then later also, just in time things that happen, and those are always recorded using like audit logs that are in Purview. So you can always really keep track quite granularly on all of the events happening on the agents.
Awesome. I love that. Both proactive and reactive measures. Thank you both. Next question. How can organizations ensure that agents respect data boundaries across different business units?
Maybe do you want me to start with that one, Betsy, or if you have some thoughts, go ahead.
No, go for it.
Yeah?
I can add.
This is live, right? So at least in the Power Platform world, typically that's done through the concept of either the environments or the environment group. So those are kind of the containers that exist within the Power Platform. And you can almost think of these things as like the organizational unit, right? How do you organize your tenant and apply your security and governance policies across the board? So this kind of varies for customers, but we do see some customers, for example, building a specific environment group where maybe that's given to a specific department, and they can build agents within those boundaries, and there's specific settings and policies that are applied to that. And that's very different to another setup that another department might have. So typically it just goes down in how you want to actually organize your tenant using the environment or environment group containers.
Yeah, really good point. The one thing I'll add to that is that this really anchors on like security being a team sport, right? As we saw in the demo, I think one of the ways to keep data safe across the organization is by creating these data loss prevention policies, which again ensure that the right people have access to the right data and it's not getting overexposed. And so I think that's where we can think about like security being a team sport, and again ensuring that the right folks are part of the right groups, so that the agents honor that when processing the data.
For sure. Thank you. And we're going to round out with one last question, and that is, what is or some key architectural decisions that impact agent security at scale?
I'll start with a more foundational question that everybody needs to ask themselves, which is, what do you need to start with? What do you want to build, right? What is the actual value that you're trying to get out of agents? And then based on that, you need to think about what is the setup, right? And typically the appropriate setup and the key architectural decisions that build off that, it does need to go back to the source of, what is the value that you're trying to unlock? But generally, to go back to the container concept that I was mentioning about the environments and the environment groups, that tends to be a pretty important thing, because the way that you organize your tenant will also have an impact on the way that you apply a lot of these security and governance policies. So if we remember even the zoned concept that we had presented with like zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, right? There are ways to kind of emulate those tiered zones within the company through these concepts of environments and groups. So it really always starts by really getting crisp on what is the value, what do you want to unlock within your company with these agents? And then based on what you want to go after, what is the best way to organize your tenant and your team so that you can actually unlock that value in a way that's still secure and keeps the CIOs and CISOs and everybody else sleeping better at night.
Sleep is important, Mick.
Yes.
So I appreciate that. And with that, we're going to close out this session. Mick and Betsy, thank you so much for your time, your insight, and providing a blueprint to building secure, scalable agents across the enterprise. For all of you in the audience, thank you for your attendance during these day one sessions. There's much more to come. Tomorrow, we'll be speaking around topics like management controls across the life cycle of agents and Copilot, measurement and reporting on the ROI and the impact of AI. And of course, something top of mind for me and for all of us is user enablement and adoption of Copilot across your organizations. So thank you again for your time. It's been a lot of fun today. And we all look forward to seeing you bright and early tomorrow to continue our Copilot Control System deep dive. Thank you all. Bye.